the 28th of April 1996, the historic tourist site of Port Arthur in Tasmania became the scene of the largest massacre ever to hit Australia.
Aussie officials are calling it the worst massacre in over 100 years.
There was one body on the doorstep, obviously shot, blood pouring out of him.
Within minutes, a gunman rampaged through the site, shooting at innocent people.
I've not seen injuries like that. There is such destruction from this sort of weapon.
The mother was carrying the 3-year-old baby when they were both shot.
The scale of the deaths and injuries that was to follow rocked the world.
Those scenes were simply horrific, and I have an extraordinary amount of admiration for everybody that had to confront those scenes on the day.
35 people were shot and killed, and 23 wounded.
I've never been involved in war, but I could think of nothing that would describe an incident such as that inside this place as the product of war.
I felt when I left Port Arthur that I had to do something.
The devastation wreaked by the mass murderer and the colossal change the tragedy provoked makes this a crime that shook Australia.
I was working. I started at 9 that morning because there wasn't many staff on. It was a really busy day.
The picturesque tourist site of Port Arthur sits on the Tasman Peninsula, an integral part of Australian history, ever since the British convicts were first shipped there in the 18th century.
Back in those days, the equivalent of Guantanamo Bay. It was a military reserve. You weren't allowed on the peninsula unless you had business there. It was run by the soldiers and Governor Arthur.
The historic site is relatively beautiful in the sense that much of it still survives. Some of it's been restored. So it has that interesting combinations of trees and plants that you would find in the United Kingdom that of course are not native in Tasmania. Port Arthur is always on the list of places to go with anybody that visits us.
On the morning of the 28th of April 1996, Kingston, along with 30 staff at Port Arthur, were preparing to welcome many tourists.
There was a lot of the management side of the organisation were at a seminar on the east coast of Tasmania, Bishano. And it's how come I ended up here on the day. It became obvious by about 11 that it was going to be more busier than what they predicted. I think we had 14 coaches end up coming in. Car parking was getting a bit of an issue because visitor centres there now wasn't there in those days. Everyone used to park under the oak trees and, you know, it was really limited.
One of the tourists visiting the site that day was Peter Croswell.
At the time I was the state manager of an organisation called Quality. It was a support program for kids with cancer and their families.
Peter's role that day was to look after other people visiting from the organisation. They chose a day out at Port Arthur.
We had one team at that particular time that had developed the program. They're based in Sydney, and they actually come over to Tasmania to do their first tour here. And it so happened that that weekend they'd been here a week, going around the primary schools, and they wanted to go down to Port Arthur. So I took them down there for the day.
Just 3 kilometres up the road from the tourist site, a local man, Martin Bryant, arrived at Seascape, a popular guest house run by David and Sally Martin. As people started to filter in to Port Arthur, Ian, one of the site's support staff, fielded the many vehicles packed with tourists.
I was sort of coordinating parking around lunchtime when Martin Bryant drove in.
Martin Bryant was a 28-year-old man from Newtown, Hobart. Like all the other tourists that day, Ian Kingston believed he was there to have a look around.
Didn't recognise him. He'd been around in the area when he was a kid, growing up, and he was entirely different to what he used to be, like he'd grown up and matured. When he drove in on the day, he wanted to park down near the jetty, and I pointed out to him that he couldn't do that because there was already about 8 coaches there. So he said, "Oh, can I park in front of the information centre?" And I said, "Well, it's better if you park along under the trees, under the oak trees. You want to get on the 1:30 ferry." And I said, "Well, you'll have to get a boarding pass from the information centre." He tried to get on the boat, couldn't get on. So he got back in the car and went and parked down in amongst all the coaches where we didn't want him to park anyway. I watched him do that. He sat there for half a minute. He got out of his car. On the back seat of his car he had like a golf bag type of thing, big bag. I saw that as he drove in. Anyway, he mucked around the back seat, got this bag out, put on his shoulder. Anyway, I didn't really take a lot of notice of it. Then he went in the boot and he was mucking around in the boot of the car. That took him a couple of minutes, fiddling with there, doing whatever he had to do. Then he walked up to the cafe.
The Broad Arrow Cafe was situated just up from the car park and the water's edge, across from the main penitentiary ruins.
He went in the front door and he was probably in there for a few minutes, might have been 10, 15, something.
As Ian continued to help other tourists, Bryant ate his meal on the deck and then went back inside. What was to happen next would change Australia forever.
And all of a sudden, I hear this bang, bang, bang. I could see dust coming out of the building from where I was looking. And I thought, what's going on? I started to make my way up there. It's still going. I thought, God, must be a bloody electrical fault. Anyway, I ran in the building, and as I went in the door, there was one body on the doorstep, obviously shot, blood pouring out of him.
Tasmania's main tourist attraction, Port Arthur, is under siege. Ian Kingston, one of the staff members, has been helping tourists throughout the morning as the site gets busier. After hearing loud noises from the cafe, he rushes to investigate and could never have prepared for what he was confronted with.
I got inside the building and there's Bryant standing with his gun, and beside him over a bit he had his big bag that he had on his back, and I could see in the bag that there was other gun of some description.
Ian faced an unprecedented situation. Martin Bryant had opened fire with a semi-automatic weapon in the busy cafe, giving the innocent customers and staff little time to react. Peter Cwell was also there with his party.
You can't comprehend. You're sitting on this beautiful April day, it's quite cool, sitting down for a cup of coffee, and then somebody starts coming and shooting people. It doesn't make sense.
The cafe and adjoining gift shop were crowded with more than 60 customers and staff when Bryant opened fire.
It takes time to react to it. You can't think it through, you just react to it. And some people reacted by running, other people reacted by hiding in cupboards.
As the cold-blooded killer indiscriminately shot at anyone in his path, Peter made the split-second decision to try to shield his colleagues from the gunfire.
I reacted in a different way. It's not a weakness, not strength. It's just the way you react, given that. And a lot of the people that were killed were older people. They didn't have the reaction time and they were virtually shot where they were sat.
As Peter took cover and the gunman continued his rampage, Ian Kingston witnessed the horror from the doorway.
There was a person to the left of me. They went to move and he turned around and shot the guy. And then while I was there, this chap behind him, he got up and moved his chair and he turned around and shot two more people then. While he had his back to me, I got out.
In the space of just 90 seconds, Martin Bryant had shot and killed 20 people, injuring a further 12. As Ian rushed away from the cafe to warn others and get them to safety, some tourists hadn't yet realised a killer was on the loose.
By that time, we had a couple of coachloads of American tourists, and they thought it was just some sort of a show. And they were all flocking from out on the oval and around the whole site to see what was going on. And like I was sort of didn't know what to do.
With no signs of relenting, Bryant continued shooting in the cafe and gift shop.
I got as many as I could together in the bun, and we started to make our way up through Government Gardens past the fountain to the parsonage. That's where I was bringing them to. So it's pretty safe.
As Ian desperately gathered as many people as he could to run to safety, the gunman started to move outside, where many unwitting tourists still had no idea what was happening.
There's the gunshots. Live action here at Port Arthur.
I looked around and I saw him come out of the cafe, and he came out and he shot a couple of shots across over the oval towards the penitentiary.
Tourists and staff tried to take cover as the cold-blooded killer headed back towards the car park. In just seconds, he took aim at people as they ran for their lives or hid for safety on the parked vehicles. Nobody was spared. Meanwhile, Ian Kingston could see the tragedy unfold as he battled to get his group to safety.
We were bringing all these people up to the parsonage, and we had the Mikacs with us. She decided she didn't want to be part of our group. It was too dangerous. She was going to leave the site. Anyway, at that point I saw him come off the bus, and I said to her, "Stay with us, he's getting in the car." No, she said, "I'm going to run up the road."
The Mikacs were a young family. Nanette and her two girls, Madeline, aged 3, and Alana, 6, visiting the site that day. Despite Ian's desperate pleas, Nanette was frantic to get her children to safety and took the decision to try and escape alone.
The Mikacs, they wanted to go home, and that was where we lost them. They just veered off and unfortunately went the wrong way.
As the family ran out of Port Arthur, Bryant also made his way off the site. he had just shot at 11 innocent people in and around the car park and jetty. The carnage and devastation left many severely wounded and others dead.
Got in the car, drove out, headed up out of the site. At the top of the site there used to be the toll booth was there when everyone paid their money. He's about halfway up and he started shooting. I thought, oh, he's probably shot the kids and all that.
Ian feared for the safety of the Mickacs. Having made the decision to leave at the same time as Bryant, they were right in his path. The gunman drove up to the family, just a few hundred meters from the exit, and stopped beside them, shooting the mother dead, before turning the gun on Madeline and Alana.
How dare someone murder two little kids after murdering their mother and chase one of them round a tree to kill her? It just beggars belief.
The enormity of the massacre was now unparalleled. A lone killer had started a callous rampage with apparently no motive. Now more than 20 people lay dead and over a dozen wounded. And the nightmare didn't appear to be ending. On seeing the brutal killings of the Mickacs, other tourists quickly hurried to get out of Bryant's path, warning anyone they could to turn back. By now, the gunman was already back in his car and making his way to the toll booth.
At that point, I heard some more shooting on top of the hill. You know, I rang the toll booth, Aileen was in there, and I told her, you know, lay on the floor. She said, all the money, we're counting the money. So, and I said, don't worry about the bloody money, just get down because he's coming back. So she just laid on the floor.
Martin Bryant had in fact murdered 4 friends at their car, pulling their bodies out of the vehicle and into the road before stealing it. The killer then drove to a local service station, targeting another car that was about to leave. The couple in the vehicle had no chance to escape. The female passenger was shot as she tried to flee, whilst the man was forced at gunpoint into the boot of the stolen car. Bryant now had a hostage. An unprecedented tragedy has happened at Port Arthur in Tasmania. A lone gunman has opened fire at the popular tourist attraction, shooting innocent visitors and staff. Dozens lie dead and severely injured as the killer continues his rampage out of the site and along the road at a service station.
What happened was that after Bryant left and continued his shooting rampage up the road, you could still hear the gunshots.
And the gunfire could be heard across the site as Ian rushed to get his group away from the danger.
Yeah, the parsonage would be about 300 metres from the cafe.
On the left.
It's the longest 300 metres ever I've walked in my whole life. It was a bit of an issue to get everyone up there as quickly as we could. As the afternoon went on, the whole phone network got clogged. It was hard, and it was hard trying to pacify visitors that were here that couldn't ring out. Couldn't get a line, trying to tell people their families overseas, they're all okay.
As the survivors waited for help, Bryant was still on the loose. After taking a hostage prisoner in the boot of his car, he drove to a place he had already been to that day, Seascape guest house. By now, emergency services had been alerted to the tragedy and were rushing to the numerous crime scenes unfolding. Terry McCarthy was a trained negotiator with Tasmania Police.
The initial call I got was extraordinarily brief. It said something along the lines of 20 dead at Port Arthur, get here now. My initial task was to try and make contact with Seascape to establish who was there and perhaps ascertain what was going on.
Whilst officers were getting into position, news of the horror was filtering through to forensic psychiatrist Ian Sale.
I heard vaguely this news flash about shootings.
At least 200 police have surrounded Port Arthur. All roads in have been blocked.
I thought, my heavens, this is happening here. I knew because I'd done occasional call-outs with the police negotiator squad. I got a telephone call from a police officer I know to ask if I could come in and lend a hand.
Information was now trickling through to Terry and Ian about the enormity of the killer's rampage. At this point, they had no idea of what to expect from this gunman. He had already callously murdered dozens of people and showed no signs of stopping.
He talked about a vehicle that was burning on the property and sort of kept asking, why aren't we doing anything about it? And it was like he'd set that fire to force police to come in to investigate what was going on. And of course, he'd set himself up to ambush those police officers should they go in there.
With a burning vehicle in front of the building, Terry had to be mindful not to rush in and put officers' lives in danger. The police also faced another challenge.
Two of my colleagues were stuck in a ditch across the road under fire, and part of my role, of course, was to keep Bryant occupied, engaged in conversation so that some sort of action could be taken to perhaps get those guys out.
The trapped officers had been the first on the scene at the guest house. Unaware of the scale of the danger, they had to take cover as he shot at them from inside the house.
It was difficult to work out exactly what weapons Bryant had. But certainly the vehicle that he'd travelled down to the historic site was subsequently located, and it was established that there were a number of weapons still in the boot of that vehicle, along with a significant quantity of ammunition. So we knew he had access to high-powered, high-capacity magazine firearms. But as to where they came from, we weren't sure at that particular stage. He was able to fire significant numbers of rounds in the general direction of police officers on the ground.
As Terry tried to get any information from Bryant, investigations were underway to try and find out who this gunman was and what possible motive he could have to cause such heartache.
Well, I'd never heard of Bryant before the day. And on the day, the information we got in, they were able to eventually identify who he was, and then they were able to identify family members. But the information that family members gave us was confusing. We were initially told that Bryant had schizophrenia, but the conversations that he was having with the police certainly didn't suggest schizophrenia, and it's not the sort of incident you would expect a person with schizophrenia to cause. But nonetheless, we were faced with that sort of information and trying to make sense of that.
With limited information on this volatile character, the police were desperate to get answers from Bryant and to try and stop any further bloodshed. But Terry McCarthy didn't receive the response he anticipated.
You're expecting a structured conversation and a belief by the other person that they have some goal that they want to achieve. Whereas we just seemed to be going through motions. It was clear that Martin Bryant really didn't have a plan. And as a consequence of that, the negotiations didn't develop in the direction that one would expect them to develop. So our focus became to establish whether there was anybody in the stronghold with him and to convince him to surrender himself without any further harm.
As the siege at the guest house appeared to be at stalemate, the hours since the initial shootings were passing by, and news of the mass killings was now spreading as medical teams desperately battled to save the victims.
It was about 2:30 or 3 in the afternoon, and my wife told me that the switchboard at the Royal had rung and that there was a major disaster.
Steve Wilkinson was head of surgical specialties at the Royal Hobart Hospital at the time.
We knew that at that stage there were going to be multiple casualties, so we formed small trauma teams. We had to clear out an entire ward of patients that were already there. We had to either send them home or move them out to other wards. We didn't know how many people were coming in. It could have been 10 or it could have been 100. We just didn't know.
With the hospital on red alert, casualties soon started arriving with varying degrees of wounds. Peter Croswell, who had shielded his colleagues in the cafe, was taken in to be treated.
There were a couple of us, like myself and my 2 working mates, who got fragments of bullets and all that type of stuff.
In trying to save his friends and dodge the gunfire, Peter was shot.
The place was so sombre, as you can imagine. It was like being in a morgue in the hospital. It was shocking. But not many people stayed there for very long. I think there was 2 or 3 of us in there for 4 or 5 days.
As Peter was treated, Steve Wilkinson and his team were trying to establish the scale of everyone's wounds.
I've got to say that I've not seen injuries like that. We see gunshots and stabbings from time to time, but there is such destruction from this sort of weapon that, there's just loss of tissue. So, there was a lot of, major sort of surgery required.
Meanwhile, 95 kilometres away at Seascape Guest House, the negotiation team was trying to establish if Bryant had injured anyone else inside. David and Sally Martin, the 2 owners, hadn't been seen for hours.
During those limited communications, we heard no sounds of life other than Bryant. And it's one of the reasons you have these negotiations. You're trying to work out what else is going on in their environment.
Bryant mentioned how he was preparing food for hostages, but the negotiators couldn't determine whether he was bluffing or telling the truth. And other information he was providing just didn't add up.
The way he spoke was more like a young teenager rather than an adult male. He was telling us stuff that was completely false. He said that he'd been out surfing or something like that, and it was complete nonsense. So there wasn't anything useful happening in that communication.
We didn't establish that rapport because there was no rapport to establish. He was in denial as to what had occurred in terms of he wasn't even making reference to what had occurred at the historic site. He was talking about some fanciful event that he claimed had occurred at another location at Fortescue Bay, which is also on the peninsula. It was like a bad script that he was operating on.
And the situation was about to get worse.
What we weren't aware of at that particular time was that the only phone within the Seascape property was a battery-operated cordless phone. We were aware that he was using that phone, but we didn't have the knowledge that there wasn't a backup landline phone that he could pick up in the event that that went flat. So that created some problems for us when, of course, it was apparent that the battery had gone flat. The difficulty, of course, is how do you get a telephone into a situation like that safely?
After hours of attempts to get some breakthrough with Bryant, the telephone line had gone flat. They were no closer to a peaceful resolution and had no idea if the hostages were safe.
When the communications broke down, it was decided that the negotiator unit would move down to a place called Tirana, which is about 5 or 6 kilometres north of Seascape. And they set up a operations area there, and various attempts were made to try and get the communication going again with Bryant, but they were all unsuccessful. They weren't able to find a way.
As daylight broke the following morning, the killer had been holed up in the guest house for 18 hours. What happened next was to stun the officers as Bryant made his next move.
The next morning, he decided to set fire to the property.
Port Arthur in Tasmania has just experienced one of the worst human atrocities in Australian criminal history. A lone gunman, Martin Bryant, has walked into a tourist attraction with a semi-automatic gun and shot at innocent people. In an attack lasting 15 minutes, over 30 victims have been killed and dozens injured. More than 18 hours on from the tragedy, the killer is still hiding in a guest house nearby with possible hostages. Negotiators have lost communication after the phone line went flat, and whilst they try to re-establish connection, Bryant changes tack once more.
He'd set fire to Seascape and then was eventually forced out by the fire.
I'm not sure why he did that. I suspect he was trying to have police take some action. That didn't occur, of course, and as a result, I think he found it a bit difficult inside, perhaps getting himself burnt. He was arrested a short period of time later when he escaped from the house.
With Seascape in flames, emergency services rushed to the aid of any hostages that might have been inside, whilst Bryant was taken to hospital.
I personally was keeping an eye on the news, and we saw that the house that he was holed up in went up in flames and that he'd been captured, and so we knew he was coming. We wound up the burns unit to receive him, and he was brought in under pretty tight security. We gave the medical and nursing staff the option of treating him or not being involved in his treatment. He had quite significant burns, and that took a while to sort those out.
Back at the guest house, officials battling the blaze were to encounter more devastation as 3 bodies were discovered. One victim was Glenn Pears, the man he had taken hostage at the service station. The others were David and Sally Martin, the owners of Seascape.
He broke off communication at one stage and said he was going to prepare food for the hostages. But I suspect, in retrospect, that the hostages were dead by then.
Officers were to also discover that Bryant's rampage had begun before arriving at Port Arthur, visiting Seascape on the morning of the tragedy and killing the Martins. But why had he singled those out?
I believe he held a grudge against the people who ran the B&B, and that's probably where it started, that grudge. I suspect that he held them in part responsible for his father's death. The death of his father is probably the central matter. His father committed suicide in a farm dam, and the family say that he was distressed by this. I believe that he suspected that his father died because of a dispute with the people who owned Seascape. I think that's probably the heart of what happened, and it started off as revenge towards them.
Martin Bryant's father, Morris, had previously tried to buy the guest house. Yet the Martins secured it first, allegedly creating stress for the Bryant family. But if this was the catalyst in sending the gunman over the edge, why did he target all the other innocent victims too?
I think that what happened then at Broad Arrow, he expected to be stopped. He thought, just like Hollywood, that there'd be some hero with a gun there who'd cut him down, but it didn't happen. There was no one there. So this was an incident that once it got that far, he wasn't able to stop. It wasn't scripted for him, and I just think it sort of got there by accident. He didn't know what to do and just kept on going.
As Bryant was treated for his burns, Ian Sale and colleagues tried to dig deeper into his background for any insight.
They were able to retrieve his hospital record, and we learned from that he'd recently been in hospital for quite a serious injury in a motor vehicle accident, and they had noticed some oddness about his behaviour, but had been assured by family that he's got schizophrenia. We also went to the house in Newtown where he'd been living, but that was confusing too. He'd been living there with this rather eccentric woman, and the house was certainly eccentric. She was a hoarder and a collector, and that showed in the house. It was a very, very weird house, to be honest.
The woman who Bryant had lived with was Helen Harvey, a friend who had died in the car accident that injured Bryant 4 years before. Her death resulted in him inheriting a substantial amount of money.
For various reasons, he'd come into a lot of money. He was unrestrained. The people who had some degree of control over him, his father, Mrs. Harvey, with whom he lived, they were both dead. It was mayhem because he could do whatever he liked. And he did.
Bryant had in fact inherited an estate worth millions of dollars. But this didn't answer the questions now being raised on how he managed to get hold of the guns in the first place.
As far as I'm aware, Bryant bought one of his weapons through a classified ad. Another one he bought from a dealer who had a shop about 2 blocks away. No one knew that he had these weapons.
Bryant had bought an array of semi-automatic weapons with ease, no questions asked. He held no license or authorization for them. His trail of devastation had ended the lives of 35 people and caused horrific injuries to 23 victims. The number of people left affected by his crime would be too high to count. Days after the mass shooting, the country was trying to come to terms with their loss.
It shocked the nation, it shocked the world, but it really shocked Tasmania. And people were just numb, I think, for days, weeks and months after it.
I got a message from John Major, the British Prime Minister. He recalled that the massacre in Dunblane in Scotland had claimed 27 lives, and John said he never imagined that within a few weeks the number killed there would be exceeded in Australia. It was a tragedy that, as the days went by, it unnerved the country. Nobody could believe that something of this magnitude had happened in Australia. These are the sort of things that happen in other countries. They don't happen in Australia. What Port Arthur did was to bring home the fact that there were gaps in the gun laws.
The Prime Minister at the time, John Howard, made quick, decisive actions to alter the legislation that was in place on guns.
The magnitude of the tragedy in Port Arthur provided the momentum for change to occur.
The law as it stood meant automatic and semi-automatic weapons were readily available and legal to citizens across Australia, with certain laws on licensing and ownership in place.
I looked at that character and I suppose I had to think, why was it so easy for you to harm so many people? Relatively insignificant character, simple-minded, but just had access to weapons that allowed him to do a heck of a lot of damage in a very short period of time.
The laws were reasonably strict, but obviously they weren't strict enough.
by the following month, the government had made the biggest change in their weapons policy to date, bringing in the National Firearms Agreement.
The agreement was that we'd have a nationwide ban on automatic and semi-automatic weapons, and we'd have strict rules about how you looked after the guns that you're entitled to have. And then we said, well, to make it work, we've got to have a buyback. And that was part of it. And I said that the federal government would fund the buyback. Now, we bought back 750,000 guns.
I take my hat off to John Howard for doing what he did, for having the guts to stand up to the gun lobby, and as far as I'm concerned now, it ought to be a hell of a lot tougher to own a gun.
The timing was certainly right after Port Arthur. It was the right thing to do. The way they approached it, and they gained a huge amount of support for it.
It has been successful. We've had since that legislation, if you define a mass murder or homicide as more than 5 killed in the same incident, we've not had any since then.
As people tried to rebuild their lives and readjust to the new gun laws, the fate of the man who wrecked so many lives was being sealed.
He wasn't mentally ill in the usual sense. He was fit to stand trial. He understood that he was charged and with 35 counts of murder and sundry other things. At that stage, when I met him, interviewed him at the prison, he was still denying his involvement.
We wanted to ensure that the police case, or the Crown's case, was so compelling and without flaw that we could successfully convict this individual for every murder that he committed.
He didn't change his mind until basically right at the end of the trial. He suddenly decided to plead guilty.
Martin Bryant's plea of guilty was accepted for all of the charges, and the Supreme Court of the day ordered 35 life sentences, and his papers were marked never to be released.
Martin Bryant was remanded in Risdon Prison, Tasmania, where he will spend the rest of his days. But despite the heartache caused, some people were intent on questioning whether he was the actual killer.
A lot of people came in afterwards, and a few of those people, for whatever motivation, came up with a different story.
They reckon, there was 2 gunmen and Wright and Bryant didn't do it and the government set him up, and all this crap that was put out. It's all a load of bullshit, because it was nothing like that, and I was here, I was in the middle of it, and I know exactly what happened. And I don't know where these stories originate and how they get going. It's just a load of rubbish, you know.
A poignant memorial now stands at the site where the Broad Arrow Cafe once was. A fitting tribute to all those affected by the tragedy on the 28th of April, 1996.
The Memorial Garden's designed for people to go there, reflect, think about things, spend their own bit of time.
The Bryant massacre just adds another layer to Port Arthur. It's horrible, it's awful, but it's not something to keep people away.
I can't help but think the best way to remember it is to recall the fact that out of this terrible tragedy, the country moved forward in gun control. And you can't remember the good without remembering the tragedy. These things are part of our history, and there's no point in trying to airbrush them.
Peter Crossell now is no longer the Peter Crossell 15 seconds before Bryant started shooting. He's a totally different person, and he is a better person. And I convinced myself that was the case. So I moved forward in life with Port Arthur Massacre embellished in here and in here. End of story.
We can't just bury it, pretend it didn't happen, it didn't exist. And those people deserve more. The victims deserve more, the survivors deserve more, the families deserve more. It is part of Australian history, and I think we need to treat it as such.
In November 2010, a small town on the fringe of the famous Barossa Valley is the scene of the most gruesome multiple murders.
People in Kapunda were scared. They were afraid that there was a killer in their midst, and they wanted to know who it was, why it was.
A family savagely murdered in their own home.
I can tell you without word of a lie, I have never heard anything as bad as the Kapunda triple murder. There is simply no comparison.
I mean, like, they were just good people. I just don't understand why someone would do this.
Destroying a family one after the other in front of their eyes, in their own home. There's no greater evil than that.
A town is left utterly stunned, whilst detectives struggle to find a motive.
What we had here was just a tragedy of epic proportion. He's sitting there skinny, weedy and weak, and I just could not believe that this was the person that had perpetrated 3 murders.
No emotion, no sorrow, no grief, no nothing. Just a very cold individual.
As 3 people lie dead, the killer would be tracked down in one of the most unlikely places, making this a crime that shook Australia. Kapunda, 80 kilometres north of Adelaide, is a small town once home to a bustling mining community.
Kapunda and the metal mine here is Australia's first commercial metal mine. It's a tourist attraction.
There are mines that you can still walk through, there are tours that you can go on, and to everybody else in South Australia, Kapunda is a low-level tourist destination. A little bit isolated as a result, and living that very stereotypical Aussie country life. You grow up with the group that you grow up with, you know them from birth through death, you take over a farm or you take over a business. On rare occasions you actually get out of the town and do something else, but you've always got that tie back there. And the bonds that form in communities like Kapunda are lifelong, sometimes whether you like it or not.
But the scene that is to unfold in Harriet Street on the morning of the 8th of November 2010 is one that the quaint tourist town has never seen before.
I was in my office going through a variety of files, and Senior Sergeant Steve Kinsman came into the office and said that they had 3 bodies had been found in the house at Kapunda. Someone else had found the crime scene. They'd contacted the local police, and there's only 2 police officers in that town. One of them attended and saw the scene. He had an ambulance arrive. He entered the house with an ambulance officer to determine that all those people in the house were beyond help and that they were deceased. The biggest crime prior to this, as far as anyone was aware of, was that someone set fire to Map the Miner, which was a symbol there.
An unprecedented scene confronted emergency services as the 3 victims sadly could not be saved.
I was hearing sporadic bits and pieces of information coming through from our investigative reporters, our police reporters, all of whom were trying to get information. What emerged very quickly was that police were keeping a very tight lid on the situation. They either knew completely what they were dealing with or had no idea whatsoever and were trying to keep things as tight as they possibly could while they sorted it out.
It's fair to say that that crime scene was very confronting. There's been some criticism by the media on that day that I didn't declare that it was a triple murder. Well, to be honest, until you get in and have a really good look, that can be a big call to make. And if you're going to tell a community that 3 people have been murdered and you don't know who's responsible for it, you better be sure that that's what you're telling them. You don't want it to turn out that it was a murder-suicide later on.
Information on the circumstances of the deaths was sporadic, but Grant Moyle and his colleagues needed to process the extent of the crime scene and uncover exactly what had happened.
First and foremost, who have we got in the house? Who lives there? And who's died in that house at that particular time? Are there any outstanding people? Early information was the names of the people involved and that their son was away in Queensland at that particular time.
The 3 victims are eventually identified as Rose and Andrew Rowe, and their 16-year-old daughter, Chantal. Their older son, Christopher, is on holiday on the Gold Coast.
While Christopher and his fiancée were up there, news broke of the murders. Christopher saw in the news coverage his street, posted a message on Facebook, "Can somebody check on my parents? That's my street." And they're talking about people being killed there. He got a reply back very early in the piece saying, "All's good." So he relaxed. But unfortunately that was misinformation. That person had mistaken which house it was, and in their effort to help Christopher, they'd given him the wrong information. Christopher then found out it was his parents and his sister. So of course, it went from being the dream holiday to the absolute nightmare.
Obviously, we had to clarify exactly when he'd left and when we're satisfied that he certainly couldn't be connected to this, and try to get some background from him. Did he know of any people who might be responsible for this? Were there any other issues with the family that we weren't aware of?
I was just absolutely devastated for the family because they were friends of mine, and Christopher remains a very, very dear friend, and I'll support him as long as I can.
As the only surviving immediate relative tries to take in the news, the police search for a motive.
What I will say is that yes, there was certainly a frenzied attack. Because of the nature of the scene, I think it was a very personal attack. And so I don't think it was just someone random. But that doesn't allay community fears, and certainly some fears from the beginning, and that was, did they have a murder on the loose in the town?
The Rowe family moved to Kapunda just a few years earlier, with Andrew running his own carpet cleaning business, and by all accounts had settled well into the community. Now viciously attacked in their home and left for dead, the police need to alleviate growing fears within the small town.
I was just devastated, but then I had to take a deep breath and say, right, we've got something on our hands here that we've got to manage and make sure our people are feeling safe.
As more details started to emerge about Andrew Rose and Chantal Rowe, questions started being asked and rumours started coming out. And they were, as is typical for Adelaide, unfortunate and unfair rumours.
Some information was coming in about the family, people were ringing up, and that information had to be followed up. A variety of different lines of inquiry. And for example, there was Andrew owned a large motorcycle that looked like a Harley Davidson, so there was some speculation of Is it bikie or drug related? Well, those things had to be ruled out. It wasn't even a Harley, so we ruled that out. But it took a number of hours to do that.
There was a sense of, of angst in the town. I think there's no doubt about that. And like any smaller community, you're going to get the Chinese whispers and all of that. So that had to be managed also.
Of course, then we were talking to the local police and the neighbours, etc., to try to get some of that other information. That was done through door knocks of the area.
As house-to-house inquiries begin and friends and relatives are questioned, an anonymous phone call is to reveal some alarming news.
Some information came in through Crime Stoppers that a person had read a post on Facebook where a person had written that they had done something terrible, didn't know how they could live with themselves, they were very sorry, and words to that effect. And that person lived very close to this crime scene, and also we could establish a connection with the family. And we thought, is this the man? Is he confessing on Facebook?
Three members of a family have been brutally murdered in the rural town of Kapunda, South Australia. Rose, Andrew and Chantelle Rowe have suffered horrific injuries in a brutal and sustained attack. Now police have discovered a message on a social network site that could lead them straight to the killer.
A person had written that they had done something terrible, didn't know how they could live with themselves. Also, we could establish a connection with the family, and we thought, is this the man? Is he confessing on Facebook? So we very quickly then had to gather the troops.
Officers raced to question the man about his message on the social networking site.
We were all hoping that this was the answer, but you're never that lucky. As it turned out, yes, we did have a team go to the house. He was spoken to, and it was clear that what he was talking about was a domestic argument, dispute that he'd had, and so we ruled him out.
As news filters back that this isn't their man, Grant Moyle learns the true extent of the victim's dreadful injuries.
Andrew and Rosemary have fought with the killer from the front of the house through to the back, and I would suggest fought valiantly during the attack. Chantelle has suffered significant injuries. Chantelle was stabbed 33 times, Andrew 29, and Rosemary 50 or more.
The intensity of the violence is hard to process, and more details will come to the fore. Just days after the triple murders, the team focus on people who could determine the family's last movements.
Rosemary and Andrew had gone away down to Adelaide Saturday night to a party.
Chantelle had had a party, and at that party several friends had attended, and things had been going well.
I understand it wasn't a big party by any stretch of the imagination, but more a case of some friends over, a few drinks, watching TV, watching movies. We went and followed up and found those friends and interviewed those. Now, all of them were helpful. We didn't have any issues with any of them. They told us what we wanted to know, gave us some access to Facebook sites to have a look and clarify some points and get some more background. We did that.
The party is to provide South Australia Police with vital links to Chantelle's partner and closest friends.
We spoke to the majority of those on the Tuesday, so the second day. During that process, a uniform officer was speaking to one of the many friends that the name Jason Downey came up.
Jason Downey is an 18-year-old Scottish teenager who emigrated to Kapunda with his mother and brother 6 years before. Having once attended the same school as Chantelle, he knows her and her boyfriend.
A statement was taken from him that day. That is the first time his name came up, but it came up no different from anyone else's at that particular time.
Police are also keen to track the last movements of Chantal's partner.
Chantal's boyfriend had sent her a text message at 5:30 a.m. on the Monday morning to her phone, asking how she was because she'd been ill the day before. And he said he didn't receive a reply, but our inquiries showed that a return message was sent from that phone. But Chantal was out of credit on her phone, so the message went off into ether space and we've never been able to retrieve it. But we know the reply was sent. It could not have been sent by Chantal. It had to be sent by the killer. And so we had a look at Chantal's boyfriend in regards to that. Was he telling us the truth? But we were able to rule him out.
As Chantal's boyfriend is eliminated as a suspect, 4 days on, Grant Moyle addresses the growing media.
Well, obviously the offender is still outstanding, and I would suggest the offender or offenders should be considered dangerous. If anyone does know who they are or has suspicions about individuals, please contact police immediately.
And the forensics team discovers something crucial at the crime scene.
The fingerprint specialists moved through the house to take fingerprints. They were spraying a substance called amino black that brings up fingerprints on different surfaces. And they were spraying that on the back of the bedroom door of Chantal's bedroom, and they were targeting a certain area and happened to pick up one fingerprint on the edge of the door, and that was quite detailed.
This is potentially a significant breakthrough. A fingerprint that does not match the victim's could narrow their search for a suspect.
Obviously we were hopeful that that would get an identification, and we got the word back the next day that unfortunately no, it wasn't on the national database, and so we had no match at that particular time. So that told us certainly told us that it wasn't any of the Rowe family.
The lack of a match on their system could simply mean the person has no criminal record. A frustrating result, but the officers press on. Meanwhile, friends, colleagues and residents continue to try and help with the investigation as the hunt for the cold-blooded killer intensifies.
At the end of that first week, sadness overtook the gossip and the speculation. People started to realise that what we had here was just a tragedy of epic proportions, an innocent family who had been absolutely slaughtered for no discernible reason.
Almost 7 days after the multiple stabbings, residents still fear a killer is on the loose, and detectives are desperate to find the culprit, when forensic officers provide another potential breakthrough.
On the 13th of November, we were advised that a DNA profile had been obtained from semen that was found on Chantal, and they had loaded that to the database, and unfortunately there was no match to it. Again, same with the fingerprint. It's great news, but just not quite what we needed at that time. But it certainly confirmed our thoughts that most likely Chantal was the key to this investigation, and the relationships she had with other people.
The team now realise that this sexually motivated attack could be central to the killer's intention, and start to focus on people associated with Chantal. Who could have any compulsion to murder a 16-year-old girl and her parents?
We had to then go about taking some samples from her male friends and to eliminate those of them having that DNA profile.
As samples are collected, one of the statements taken from a friend sets alarm bells ringing.
We were sitting in the command post, and John was reading one of the statements and said, "Oh, let's have a look at this. There's just something not quite right about that." He started to give an alibi when he wasn't asked for one. He made some comments about not being invited to the party on the Saturday night. of not having a girlfriend and really trying to come up with an alibi without being asked for one, trying to paint a picture. And we thought, we'll do a bit more work on this. That included ringing his place of employment to say, what do you know about this individual? He was visited on Sunday, and a DNA sample and fingerprints were taken from him. And he volunteered that without any problems.
This young man is Jason Downey. He freely offers to help with inquiries, but officers also notice something unusual.
Police officers had visited him and seen the cuts on his hand. Because of the nature of the attack inside the house, it would not be unusual for the offender to suffer some sort of injury as well. He said that he'd, at the relevant times, he was elsewhere. He was in Freeling, he was in Gawler, he was with another person. He had sustained the injuries to his left hand as a result of falling off a push bike.
With Downey's relaxed attitude and willingness to help, could the cuts be the result of a fall or something far more sinister? Officers have to wait less than 48 hours to find out.
At 9:30 a.m. on Tuesday morning, I got the phone call that the sample was a match to Downey.
In the old mining town of Kapunda, just outside Adelaide, a vicious killer is yet to be caught. Almost 1 week after a family has been slain in their home, the investigation team has just received their biggest breakthrough so far.
The sample was taken from Downey on the Sunday, and at 9:30 a.m. on Tuesday morning, I got the phone call that the sample was a match to Downey, which was just fantastic for us.
This is the turning point in the triple murder inquiry. The swab taken from Jason Downey matches DNA found on Cwell.
I felt that then was the time to move. We couldn't wait any longer. We were on very, very good ground. And so we made the decision, that day, that we would arrest him that evening.
This apparently unassuming 18-year-old has potentially broken into a family home and attacked 3 defenseless people with a knife, inflicting over 100 wounds. Officers realize they must take their next step with caution.
We could march into his workplace and arrest him there, but there's other people that work there. He's a mechanic, he's in a workshop. What weapons or other things were there? If he ran off, what might be the consequences of that? If we went to his home to arrest him there, might he, if his mother was home and there was another woman who lived there as well, might he take them hostage? I didn't want to alert him that we were about to take that step because we didn't want to endanger anyone else.
Officers set about planning a way to get to their number 1 suspect.
We had asked a number of people to come in and sign their statements throughout this investigation. He had one there unsigned, so we decided we'd ask him through his manager to drop in on his way home and sign the statement. He was dropped off at the station and informed he was under arrest.
Armed with the DNA results of the testing of the semen and of the fingerprint, 8 days on from the violent murder of Rose, Andrew and Cwell Rowe, South Australian police urgently question one teenager who might be the key to it all. With this powerful forensic evidence, what would Jason Downey reveal?
He said that he'd had consensual intercourse with Cwell some months beforehand. It was explained to him that that couldn't account for the way we'd found the DNA sample, but that seemed to just be dismissed by him. He offered an explanation that he had been at Chantell's boyfriend's place for a while, had left there and driven down to Gawler to McDonald's, had done a number of different things, visited different people. and came back. He'd come back home, he'd had an argument with his mother, and his mother locked him out of the house. So he had to sleep in the car that night. And it was shortly after 11 p.m, as I understand it, that he had that argument and was forced out of the house.
Chantel's boyfriend informed Jason that he wouldn't be staying over at Chantel's house that night. She was ill. She wasn't going to be going to work the next day. She had a bit of a cold. Downey knew that he was not going to be there that night.
But he came up with an excuse that he'd, at the relevant times, he was elsewhere. He had sustained the injuries to his left hand as a result of falling off a push bike first, and then later he told someone else it was falling off a motorbike.
Downey's alibi isn't adding up, and he has no real explanation for his DNA being found on one of the victims' bodies. As they press for more answers, detectives are keen to let Christopher Rowe know of the latest developments.
As soon as Downey had been arrested, I went around to his home with our victim contact officer and informed him that someone had been arrested and what charges were laid.
As the slightly built teenager faces serious charges, Christopher Rowe now has to brace himself for seeing the alleged killer of his family in court.
The Elizabeth Magistrates Court's interesting because it's home to a lot of low-level crime. I thought they'd brought up the wrong person. I thought they'd brought up some skinny little drug dealer that had been caught on a street corner selling meth to some kids. But no, that was him. I turned around and I looked at the faces of the family members of the Rowes who had come to the court case, and I knew it was him. The hatred and malevolence and grief pouring out of their expressions told the whole story. They knew who he was, and already they had some sense of what was going on.
Once that person was arrested for the crime, I think that's when the community started to get back to some type of normality. I mean, there's probably many that didn't, but I think by and large, I think most people thought, right, that's it.
Jason Downey maintains his innocence during a number of appearances in court.
It was supposed to be 6 weeks. It took over a year. Part of the reason it was blowing out was because the police were continuing their investigations. They wanted to make sure they had everything locked down tight. The other part was Downey himself. What we didn't know at the time was that Downey had started calling his mother and calling his brother from jail, writing them letters and talking about the fact that he didn't do it. The police had come across that correspondence with Downey's mother, with Downey's brother, where he blamed a man in the dark clothing with the green shopping bag, where he claimed, "Oh, I fucked up, Mum. I was in the house and I cradled Chantel as she died, but I didn't do it and I should have told the cops. I'm so sorry." From my understanding, what the police were trying to do was make sure they had DNA evidence locked down, they had fingerprint evidence locked down, footprint evidence, any circumstantial evidence that could put Jason at the house at that time, talking to witnesses about his attitude, talking to people about his obsession with Chantel, scouring his Facebook page, his Bebo page, his internet usage for connections to Chantel, his text messages, his use of his phone, all of those pieces of evidence that would paint the picture of someone that would do anything to be in a romantic relationship with Chantel, to eliminate these ridiculous claims that he was making of a man wearing dark clothes, carrying a green shopping bag, running out of the house, to counteract his claims of, "I was there and Chantel died in my arms, but I didn't do the murder." Anything that could put those knives in his hands at those times. And that was a lot of pressure for them, and they had to get that locked down tight.
Whilst trying to prove Downey's claims are false, South Australia police also uncover more damning evidence against him.
What we did recover from the scene was a digital camera on the kitchen table, I think it was, and we examined that and found the photos of a family lunch that they'd had together, the Rowes had had together on the Sunday afternoon. Those photos proved great evidence because Chantel was holding a USB stick at that time. We were to find the USB stick in his bedroom at his home address and the lanyard to it in his vehicle, I believe. We also found some blood staining on the console of his car that was to be Rosemary and Andrew Rose. We were able to determine through the examination of the laptop that there'd been a failed login on Chantel's laptop sometime after she was murdered, and that there was some blood staining on the keyboard, but unfortunately not sufficient enough for us to get a DNA profile from.
And the bloody fingerprint found on Chantel's door has finally come back as a match to Downey. More than 1 year on from the tragedy comes one of the biggest turning points in the case so far.
He finally pleaded guilty. I think it came as quite a shock to the system.
In one of the most horrific cases to hit South Australia, Jason Downey has been under the microscope as damning evidence links him to 3 of the most brutal murders ever witnessed in the country.
It's something that I think everyone's going to have nightmares over for many years to come.
Now, in a revelation, the suspected murderer, who has claimed his innocence all along, shocks the court.
He finally pleaded guilty, and as it would transpire, that he pleaded guilty 1 year and 1 day after the actual crimes. On each occasion, Christopher had attended, and quite a number of the other relatives and friends had attended those court cases.
It's very hard for both families to have lived with this moment. We're all getting through it. We hope he gets what he deserves.
It was a long process for them and a traumatic process for them.
Downey pleads guilty to the 3 murder charges. Shortly following the anniversary of the tragedy, the family and friends of the victims must now listen to the harrowing details coming out in court.
When a person pleads guilty in a South Australian court, the role of the judge changes to a finder of fact, because a judge must determine a penalty appropriate to that exact crime. The prosecution had no choice but to go through the evidence and, pardon the pun, blow by blow. And that was when everybody concerned with the case got an idea of just what had happened in that house that night.
For the first time, the circumstances surrounding that horrific night are laid bare for all to hear.
He gave an account through his lawyer about what happened that night. I don't accept everything that he said. He has certainly stood in the bath at some stage before the attacks have taken place because of the nature of the shoe print that was there. Whether he actually came in through that window or not, I'm not 100% convinced, but nonetheless he certainly has been in there at some stage. He gave an account of Chantel being attacked first and then having to murder the parents as a result so that he wouldn't get found out.
One of the knives from the Rowe family kitchen became involved, and Andrew was stabbed in excess of 20 times. He was stabbed so many times and with such force that pieces of the knife broke off in his body. There was then a confrontation, according to the court's accepted version of events, with Rose. And again, another knife was introduced. She was stabbed multiple times. She would go on to be stabbed in excess of 50 times by the time that the murder had concluded, but this was sadly the first set of stabbings for her. After they fell, the court ruled that Downey moved into the bedroom.
The poor girl was underneath her bed bleeding from what's been described as a free-flowing wound and has been dragged back out from under the bed and further attacked.
He placed her on top of the bed. He then continued to stab her. In the end, it was 33 different wounds. Then stripped her of her clothing, redressed her, left her on the bed.
After a frenzied and prolonged attack, Downey feebly attempts to cover his tracks and then decides to continue his merciless rampage.
the thing that has always struck me the most about this is that at least 2 members of that family knew someone they loved was being murdered while they were there. And she died having listened to both of her parents be killed and then undergoing that insidious torture herself. It just defies belief.
After an initial attack, he's attempted to clean up some of the crime scene and he's attacked them again. And we know that by the nature of the crime scene.
He tried to mop around Andrew and paused to stab him several more times. It's believed that he then noticed that Rose was still alive and was trying to make her way to the door. And he proceeded to deliver the last of the 55 stab wounds that she would receive until she was dead. At that point, Jason gave up on trying to clean up and left bloody sock prints as he ran out of the house. Nobody saw him leave. All that anybody heard was Rose screaming help 3 times and a noise like something falling over.
Prior to him being sentenced, he, through his solicitor, gave directions on where the shoes he was wearing could be found, and it was the local police officer who followed those directions and eventually found them, which wasn't far from the murder scene. Then he tried to give directions on where he'd hidden his clothing, the weapons, and some clean-up items, because he cleaned up and took those items with him. We took him out of custody just before he was sentenced and spent a day travelling around that area. We were only ever able to recover some clothing of his. We never found the knives.
This detailed account of the level of violence has to be released for the court to hear. Family and friends also have to endure information about Downey's unbelievable actions after he has murdered Andrew, Rose and Chantel.
He's never shown any remorse throughout this whole process. And if you look at his actions after the murder, the night, he's left the scene, he's gone off, he's disposed of his shoes, he's disposed of some clothing, he slept in his car that night. He's attended work the next day, albeit slightly late. Pretended he didn't know anything about it until supposedly hearing it on the news that afternoon, then feigning grief, having to go home early, and then not being able to work the next day because of his grief.
And the cover-up doesn't stop there. Downey is also filmed attempting to show his alleged grief in a very public manner.
He's laid a card and teddy bear at the back gate of the house where a lot of people laid tributes, and he's just played the normal local in grief about what has happened.
Here's a way of people paying him attention, but I've got an excuse that I can go with to get me out of it, so that you don't think really that I'm the killer, but maybe you'll talk about me a little more. Buy a little grey teddy bear, one of the Friends Forever brand, take it, stop, pause, look longingly at the memorial, make sure you know that the camera's filming you at that point. It's like out of a movie scene. He was composing this in his head, that was his dramatic moment, and he was taking full advantage of it. But also it's an excuse, because if I went back there and left a memorial, clearly I didn't do it.
He's mixed with these people during that whole week, even with Chantel's boyfriend. I just don't know how he could do that.
This window into Downey's psyche is also evident from stories of his behaviour whilst in custody.
He considered himself the big man, chest puffed up, walking around. I did the Kapunda triple murders. I did those killings. That was me. I was in court today. Big noting himself. Now, I'm sure some of that was fear, because again, 52 kilograms in a South Australian prison filled with pedophiles, bikers and killers, you'd want to be looking out for yourself very quickly. The family was steeling themselves for a long trial, so were the police and so were the media.
After a grueling process lasting more than a year, with all the facts scrutinised, the judge finally delivers his long-awaited sentencing in one of the biggest criminal cases to hit South Australia.
He calculated that Downey deserved a sentence of 35 years, one of the highest in South Australian history. Downey barely reacted again. It wasn't that he didn't care, I think he just didn't understand. I don't think he has the intelligence needed and the insight needed to understand how long 35 years really is. That it's longer again than he's been alive. And that when 35 years expires, he's not necessarily going to get out.
For closure for the family and everything else, it needs to be. And he was obviously guilty. There's no question in my mind about that.
The sentence provokes an emotional reaction from the victim's family.
Please explain to me the justice in this. This is not a justifiable offence. He cannot return my family to me, so why should he have the right to any definition of life?
He pleaded guilty on this occasion and strung it out as long as he could because he knew the evidence against him was overwhelming. Not because he felt bad for what he did, but he knew, what's the point now? If I plead guilty now, I'll get a discount to some degree, which he did.
As the family tried to process the outcome of the sentence, Sean Fuster learns of another rumour that threatens to cause even more pain.
My editor said to me, "Sean, was Chantel pregnant?" No. Was it ever suggested she was pregnant? No, not in court. There was a rumour way back at the very beginning, an ugly rumour, but the cops knocked that down within the first week, boss. Why? The newspaper just splashed all over their website that she was killed and she was pregnant. I couldn't believe it. I thought, this family has dealt with enough. And I went tracking down the stringer that had written it. And I said to him, "Where do you get off? It's been publicly knocked down. It wasn't mentioned once in court. How could you possibly attach that?" "Oh, well, I thought it would be interesting." What I said to him next is unrepeatable. It's undoubtable that Jason Downey is extremely immature. He was raised with no male perspective on his life, no father figure. He had a stepfather, but that was much later in life, after he and his mother and brother moved to Australia from Scotland, leaving his older sister behind.
As Downey begins his sentence of more than 3 decades without his freedom, he decides to write a letter attempting to apologise for his crimes.
The biggest sign of Jason's immaturity was the letter that he wrote, which to my mind is the single most inexplicably inadequate apology that's ever been committed to paper. It's juvenile. The handwriting is juvenile. There are loops for I's, there are missing words, there are random capitalizations, there are spelling mistakes all through it. And he apologises for my recent actions and how sad he is that he no longer has a car and a career. There's no perspective, there's no insight. He may very well be sorry in a limited way, but he doesn't understand fully what he's done. Just that incredibly blinkered, narrow understanding of what he's done and the tragedy that he's perpetrated.
I think, in due respect, there's a lot of hurt out there that we didn't know about. A lot of people probably grieving a lot more than we suspect and probably still are. And that's why we have this ongoing respect and we're careful in how we go about talking to anybody in relation to it now.
The lives of Chantel, Rose and Andrew Rowe have been taken in the most cowardly and unimaginable way. The murderer is to serve the majority of his adult life in prison. But for those left behind, the main question still lingers. Why did Downey go to the lengths of killing a mother, father and their young daughter?
His goal was to have Chantel, whether that was emotionally, whether it was physically, whatever it took. Being confronted by Andrew probably being told something along the lines of "get out, you little freak," or "what the hell are you doing in my house?" being questioned caused the snap. I don't think this was premeditated in the sense that he went there with the intent to kill, but he was prepared to do whatever it took to make Chantal his that night, up to and including murder in a way that he hadn't prepared for consciously, but something in him was clearly prepared to do. His lawyer said to the court, "I can't give Your Honour an explanation for what happened. My client doesn't remember it. He snapped into a fugue state." And the court has to ask itself how a person of his size, of his nature, with no criminal record could possibly do something like this. The prosecution had a very easy answer for it. It's very simple, Your Honour, he's a liar. He's a liar and he's a coward and he's a vicious brute. That's it. The motive's as old as time itself, simple jealousy, and he snapped.